This is a moment.
It's irrational what he's doing, and you know it.
Well, it's not irrational to stand up to the Iranians.
It's irrational to be posting.
It's not irrational, but we're in a moment.
Pictures of himself.
We're in a moment.
Scott Jennings, one of the loudest defenders of the MAGA movement, walked back onto Abby Phillip's panel and immediately slipped into the role he's become known for, shielding Trump from criticism no matter how absurd the situation becomes. This time, the controversy centered around Donald Trump circulating an AI-created image that framed him like a divine figure, sparking outrage and a fierce debate over politics, religion, and the cult-like loyalty surrounding him. The discussion quickly turned explosive as the panel clashed over whether any line still exists when it comes to defending Trump's behavior. We're going to unpack the entire confrontation, examine the arguments being thrown around, and look at why this moment struck such a nerve. Let's dive into it together.
Suddenly, Republicans don't want religion in politics. President Trump's war of words with the Pope is again escalating, but this time it's his allies that are doing the talking. For days, President Trump has criticized the Pope for speaking out against the Iran war, which has received bipartisan backlash. And then, of course, he added fuel to the fire when he posted a picture depicting himself as Jesus. He posted another picture today, but this time he is alongside AI Jesus. The Pope continues to advocate for peace, even doing so again tonight, while Republican officials are lecturing him on all things theology and doctrine.
Now, we can, of course, have disagreements about whether this or that conflict is just, but I think that it's important, in the same way that it's important for the Vice President of the United States to be careful when I talk about matters of public policy, I think it's very, very important for the Pope to be careful when he talks about matters of theology. Well, you've got to make sure it's anchored in the truth.
The Pope needs to keep his business into leading his flock, so to speak, leading the church, and probably stay out of the political arena. He doesn't need to be getting involved in the political arena. Go lead your church. I didn't elect the Pope to be president.
A pontiff or any religious leader can say anything they want, but obviously if you wade into political waters, I think you should expect some political response, and I think the Pope's received some of that.
It's not clear when a life and death war became just politics. But here we are in this moment for the church and state and war. I mean, since when are popes told they can't talk about war, they can't talk about peace, they can't talk about people who are dying and people who are living all around the world?
Since the beginning of the year of our Lord, popes have talked about peace, whether they were in war times, we were in war times, or peace times. Popes talk about peace. This Christmas, I will get dozens, if not more, of cards that say, peace on earth, goodwill towards men. I'm not really sure what is going on in this country, but we have a lot going on. And to say the Pope needs to be careful when he's discussing theology just makes no sense to me. It just really doesn't. The Pope is doing what popes do. And, you know, the president wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He talks about wars that he's stopped around the world. Isn't that about peace? So I'm not sure what we're doing.
Remember, he doesn't need the Nobel Peace Prize. He already got that prize from FIFA.
As a practicing Catholic, I know that the Vatican doesn't operate in our political paradigm. It's in the divine spiritual realm. So when the Pope sounds like the UN spokesperson saying no confrontation, no conflict, only peacekeeping, only diplomacy, that is totally normal. However, we learned this lesson with Pope Francis, who waded into politics probably more than any other Pope before him, at least in terms of our modern politics. You do have to care about precision and exactitude as the successor to Peter, as someone who is informing the opinions of so many lay Catholics. So when you say, as the Pope, and I say this as a practicing Catholic, that God does not hear the prayers of those who wage war, that is a bit precarious and does risk confusing practicing Catholics, because does that mean the war to fight Hitler in World War
I need to stop the video here for a moment, because this is exactly where the contradiction starts becoming impossible to ignore. I was raised in the Catholic Church. I spent years in Catholic classrooms surrounded by teachings about the authority of the Pope. And the message I always understood was that the Pope was not treated like some ordinary political commentator whose words only mattered when people personally agreed with him. The position carried spiritual authority. That was the entire point. What's strange is that this understanding suddenly seemed to collapse the moment certain popes began expressing views that clashed with modern conservative politics. That's when the standards appeared to change. Instead of treating papal guidance as something serious, people started creating escape routes around it whenever the message became inconvenient. If the Pope said something that aligned with their ideology, his words were elevated. If he challenged them, suddenly he was dismissed as just another man with an opinion. Now we're watching the same pattern repeat itself again. A pope speaks against war, and immediately people begin inventing technicalities to explain why his words supposedly should not carry weight in this situation. The authority becomes conditional, the rules become flexible, and the justification always seems to depend on whether the political right approves of what is being said. That shift has always stood out to me because it feels completely disconnected from what I remember being taught growing up. So for those of you who also came from Catholic backgrounds, I'm genuinely curious what your experience was. Were you raised to believe that the Pope's teachings held real authority within the Church, or was it presented as something believers could casually reject whenever it conflicted with their politics? Because I honestly do not remember hearing that mindset until much later. Anyway, let's keep going.
Against the Soviet Union, was that unjustified? I'm just saying that to say that he should be a little bit more precise, that's not like this.
Okay, but it's rather rich. It's rather rich for...
Before you jump in, Anna, there is actual clarity from the Catholic Church on this, to your point. And the Bishop James Massa, the Doctrine Committee Chair, so this is straight from the Catholic Church, says, a constant tenet of that 1,000-year tradition is a nation can only legitimately take up the sword in self-defense once all peace efforts have failed. That is, to be a just war, it must be a war of defense against another who actively wages war, which is what the Holy Father actually said. Quote, he does not listen to the prayers of those who wage war. So it continues, when Pope Leo speaks as supreme pastor of the Universal Church, he is not merely offering opinions on theology. He is preaching the gospel and exercising his ministry as the vicar of Christ. So he's basically saying, in fewer words, the Pope is teaching the gospel. He is speaking literally what the just war theory is. And I guess my question to you is, do you think that J.D. Vance knows more about Catholic theology than the Pope?
Well, like, I hear what you're saying about just war theory. That was created by St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. And what you're saying is that it has to be proportionate to the
I'm
actual
not saying
threat.
It, just to be clear.
No, that is what just war theory is. But it's also up to lay Catholics, according to the Vatican II Council, Second Vatican Council, to decide what that means for temporal matters. Just because the Pope makes some sort of dictate on political issues, that's not a religious proclamation.
I too am a Catholic, not a very flawed one. Granted, when I go to church, it should burst into flames. But here's what I know. In my lifetime, I've known no Pope that has more political involvement than John Paul II. He was part of a triumvirate with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in beating communism. He did things like show up in Cuba. He did things like show up in Nicaragua and confront the Sandinistas to their face. So popes have always been political. It comes with a job. I do think that the job of U.S. president and the job of pope are two completely different things, and each of them is speaking to their constituent. I think it's ridiculous that we're having like a rational conversation and debate here about theology, because the insane, decrepit, senile old man who's in the White House is posting pictures of himself, posing like Jesus, and attacking the Pope. This is, and I think it's rather rich and ridiculous and ironic for J.D. Vance, who is the vice president, to the president who is the least careful with words in my lifetime in this country, the man who celebrates death of Rob Reiner and Bob Mueller, the man who cusses on Easter Sunday. For now, J.D. Vance wants people to be careful with their words, or maybe he should tell the guy he works for.
Does she have a point about that? Why, first of all, why criticize the Pope and say, you better be careful with your discussion of theology and your use of words, when he doesn't care whether or not his own boss is careful with his words?
Yeah, I heard the vice president there. I actually think he had it backwards. I think that the Pope should be talking about theology. I respect the Pope's role in running the Catholic Church, and I also respect Donald Trump and J.D. Vance's role in American politics. That's their realm in which to be speaking their mind. And so I thought he had it backwards. It's interesting that you referenced Pope John Paul II and President Reagan. I was thinking about this this evening. There's a tremendous opportunity here for this Pope. If he would look at it this way, we're in the middle of a ceasefire. This blockade is working. There are no bombs falling. There's diplomacy going on right now. And there is a real chance, because of what Trump has done and the situation we find ourselves in, for the world to bring pressure, economic pressure, and diplomatic pressure, just like what was done in the 80s, to bear against this terrorist regime, just the way it was brought to bear against the Soviets in the 1980s. And so I get the feeling sometimes the Pope might be feeling a little adversarial, at least in some of his comments toward President Trump. I don't know that personally. It's my sense of it. But in this moment where you have, there's no bombs falling right now. There's a blockade. There's some restraint going on, and there's talks going on. This to me is a moment where you could have a partnership for peace in a way that brings this terrorist regime that, by the way, has been at war with the West for nearly 50 years to its knees. And I think just the way we brought the Soviets to their knees, it could happen right
here. Don't you think that opportunity goes both ways? In other words, it's also an opportunity for the President of the United States to cultivate an alliance with the leader of the Catholic Church and other foreign leaders, frankly, because what he's done by taking on the Pope is not just antagonize Catholics, he's antagonized people like his ally Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, where the Vatican is.
It's a fair question. It's a fair question.
The Reagan, John Paul II, Margaret Thatcher thing was years of cultivation of relationships.
But this is a moment.
In the morning tweets.
But this is a moment.
It's irrational what he's doing, and you know it.
Well, it's not irrational to stand up to the Iranians.
It's irrational to be posting.
It's not irrational. But we're in a moment.
Pictures of himself.
We're in a moment. And let me live.
Trump said, well,
let me live in reality today.
Let me just reiterate to the audience. The president said in a message that an entire civilization may die tonight.
On Easter Sunday.
He said that. So a lot of people read that as him threatening to wipe out an entire civilization. So the Pope, it does seem like the Pope would actually be rational to respond to that and to say, hey, we shouldn't be in the business of war. And I think you're right that I'm sure the Pope is happy that there is a ceasefire, but he was responding to Trump waging a war. Does he not have a right to respond to that part of it too?
He has a right to say whatever he wants, but I would just say we're waging war against people who've been waging war against us for nearly 50 years. And look, the reality is, and the moment that we're in is special because we've got this regime on its knees economically, which has China. That's a problem for them as well. We've got a moment here where we can change something and change a situation that's been bad for tens of millions of people for going on 5 decades now. And I just, my hope, look, by the way, a lot of politicians in America disagree with the Pope. Do you guys agree with the Pope about abortion and gay marriage?
Well, let me say this.
The answer is no. And that's okay.
Hold on
and that's okay. It happens all the time.
But we all should agree with the Pope on
a lot of
peace.
people, not everybody's a Catholic. A lot of people disagree with
Donald
the Pope.
Trump's not a Catholic.
Hold on a second. A lot of people disagree with the Pope on a lot of doctrinal issues.
And he was not in line.
But hang on just a second. Before we go down that road, because we also know that Donald Trump supported abortion before he opposed it. But also,
he's been the most pro-life president we've ever had.
The response when you disagree with the Pope is very different from what Donald Trump did. What Trump said was the Pope is weak on crime. The Pope, he's insulting the man rather than just saying we have to disagree.
I agree with you.
Let's not whitewash what actually happened.
You don't measure the Pope by those political metrics.
That's one of the most interesting things.
Hold on, Carolyn. I'm not understanding. I mean, I'm just saying Trump's response to his disagreement is not what anybody else's response is. Rather than just saying we disagree, the Pope is he's a figure of the church. I respect his opinion. We agree to disagree. He insulted the Pope. He attacked him repeatedly on social media. That is not.
What this entire exchange revealed more than anything else is how quickly consistency disappears the moment Trump enters the conversation. Throughout the debate, you could watch the conversation bend in real time as people scrambled to defend behavior that would normally be condemned instantly if it came from anyone else. The standards kept shifting depending on who was being criticized. One of the biggest points raised during the panel involved the Catholic Church's own position on war and self-defense. And when those principles were actually explained, it became difficult to ignore why the Pope responded the way he did. People can bring up decades of tension with Iran, talk about terrorism, or broaden the discussion into global politics, but the central issue being argued was much simpler than that. The question was whether launching military action first can honestly be framed as an act of defense. From that perspective, it becomes obvious why a religious figure whose role centers around peace and moral responsibility would publicly condemn escalation and violence. Yet somehow, outrage was directed more toward the Pope for speaking than toward the destruction and suffering that come with war itself. As the discussion continued, another familiar pattern started showing itself. Every time Trump's language or behavior was mentioned, the response from his supporters followed the same formula: deny the meaning, soften the wording, reinterpret the statement, or insist the public misunderstood what was plainly said. Reality gets rewritten in real time until accountability completely disappears. That's what makes debates like this feel so draining to watch. Some people on the panel were attempting to argue from a position of consistency and evidence, while others seemed focused entirely on protecting Trump from criticism, regardless of what had actually happened. But I want to hear your perspective on all of this. Do you think the criticism directed at Trump was justified? Do you think the Pope had every right to speak out? Or do you believe Scott Jennings made the stronger argument during the debate? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more discussions like this, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.